Maurizio Vecchione as a moderator.
It's the dreaded hour in the afternoon. We're after lunch and you've been listening to speeches all day, so it's my job to try to liven things up for you, although we will not do a British-style debate the way we did yesterday. But I would like to invite our panelists up here. Perfect. And I am really excited to have this conversation. The sort of notion of applied science versus pure science struck me once, not too long ago. I was having a conversation with David Baltimore, and he basically, was talking to me, and I happen to be one of those basic scientists in the sense that I'm a physicist. And he said, "Why do you want to do applied science? Don't you want to discover the fundamentals and let other people, let the engineers do the applied sciences?" And it struck me that relatively old-fashioned attitude, though, does pervade the funding systems, does pervade the way we even think about universities and departments, and we perhaps manage our research. And of course, today, we've been doing nothing but hearing about how the lines are really blurred and how the fundamentals of basic science really don't get translated efficiently without the use of that interdisciplinary approach that also involves engineering. So I am very lucky today to have a very distinguished group of panelists that, as it's now become tradition here at Terasaki, represent very different perspectives. And I'm going to be challenging them to sort of explore this question: is there a schism between applied and basic science? Should we be thinking about blurring these lines? And ultimately, what does it take to do this translation? So that's sort of kicking off the panel. I think the first step is I'd like everybody to maybe very quickly introduce yourselves. And I should point out that we have a panelist on his way here that will join us. So there is a missing individual that hopefully will fill in shortly. So, Al.
Okay, hello everybody, I'm Al Pisano. I'm the Dean of Engineering at UC San Diego. Go Tritons. Okay, Bruins guys, stay calm, stay calm. Spent 30 years at Berkeley. Oops, stay calm again, Bruins guys, stay calm, stay calm. And I'm going to take the position that the line is already blurred, and it's the job of academia to start the mixing.
Fantastic.
Hi, everyone. My name is Elliot Swartz. I am the lead scientist specializing in cultivated meat technology at the Good Food Institute, which is an international network of nonprofits that's trying to develop the roadmap for a more sustainable food supply. And so we're really focused on driving alternative protein technologies like cultured meat, the technologies that can replace animal meat, egg, and dairy products to have success in the marketplace. And so my role in a nutshell is really to think about what are the technical and economic bottlenecks that are facing this industry as it matures, and figuring out what we can do about that to make sure that they're not a problem in the future. And I'll hopefully talk a little bit more about that today.
Good afternoon, a bunch of friends and some people I don't know yet. My name is Art Corey. I come from an industry background. Started in 1965, quote, retired from industry, including companies such as Medtronic and Genzyme, in 2008. And then in 2014, I was recruited to become a professor at Northeastern University. And my field has been biomaterials and medical devices.
Fantastic. So, I guess I kicked us off thinking about this difference between applied versus basic science. I'd be curious to sort of hear each one of yours definition of each one of those. Do you think about science, period, or do you think about some clear differences in applied sciences versus basic. Al, maybe we'll start with you.
All right, fine. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'll offer a graphic example. So when I talk to my faculty about they're interested in the fundamentals or the applied, I ask them, what is more beautiful, the thing you're studying or the smile on the face of someone who is impacted by it? And you will get different answers. So I would offer that if you really, you could think of 1,000 different ways to define the difference. I like to think about defining it based on outcomes. If a very wonderful theory emerges, if a new particle is discovered, if a new protein folding trick is uncovered, and a bunch of people who love to look at the proteins warmly praise you and smile about it, then you know that you're doing something very, very fundamental. But if two doctors walk up to you and say, hey, I know somewhere that might be useful, and you become more motivated in seeing the patient outcomes, then you are very, very much applied. And so I'll just offer briefly, I see some of my faculty from my school here. They come from nanoengineering, which is where they look at nanoscience in order to have outcomes. And so if it's, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with a deep study in the discipline itself. That is necessary, but it's just not sufficient anymore.
Very insightful. And maybe we'll do a round robin and just...
Sure. Yeah, I think obviously people probably have like a notion of the sort of personnel that are involved here, where applied science typically is more interdisciplinary. You might have scientists and engineers from different perspectives coming in and contributing to a common outcome. But I do like thinking about the similarities as well. And I think the way that I think about it is mostly being sort of two sides of the same coin, where you have, the basic science is largely, curiosity driven, but eventually you get this sort of foundation of knowledge that someone can then come and put a practical application to that knowledge. But I think by doing so, you're sort of tinkering around in the real world, and that presents new challenges. And therefore, you sort of establish this feedback loop between basic and applied science. And I think that feedback loop, that's sort of where I think of as the sweet spot for translation, because you're understanding what are the real sort of pressing challenges on the edge that the people in the industry might be facing, and how do we sort of turn that into opportunity, research opportunities and new ideas that basic scientists can explore. So that's sort of where a lot of my work fits, and that's what I really get to enjoy, I think, from my perspective.
And Arthur?
I think it has to do with intent. You may never achieve what you want, but good science is good science, in my opinion. And if your intent is to produce something that is beautiful, publishable, and has a good outcome in its own right, that's maybe what I don't like to use the word basic and applied. I like to use the word discovery and implementation. But one of the things you suggested was have a case study. So if I might do it real quick,
Please.
A case study. If everybody looks at the floor, you'll see a bunch of pentagons. And if you take 12 of those pentagons, you're able to make a closed spherical type of thing. It's like a soccer ball, but that has 32 5 and 6 sided sides. And when I chose my professor because I'm a synthetic organic chemist and I wanted to do synthetic organic chemistry. And he offered me two choices. One of them was to develop his concept of the dodecahedron, called dodecahedrine, which was the closed mini soccer ball, versus to develop synthetic analogs of morphine. And because there was no further intent other than to publish and develop your reputation, to develop this closed dodecahedron versus possibly a new type of drug, a morphine analog, an analog of morphine. I chose the latter because that had a practical intent, a practical outcome in mind. The other one, he never did incidentally succeed before he retired, but a guy named Leo Paquette, he retired in 1976, my advisor, Professor Fred Kelsch. But Leo Paquette did come up with that in about 1982 after he retired. But the intent was nothing beyond the great publishable chemistry versus develop a product. That's my idea. Thank you.
Terrific. And John, thank you.
My apologies.
That's all right. We know you were working, so you have the right excuse. But do you mind doing a quick introduction for yourself, and then maybe you can give us your thoughts on sort of defining basic versus applied sciences and how you would think about it?
Okay, thank you. My name is John Aitchison, and I'm at Seattle Children's Research Institute and at the University of Washington Department of Pediatrics. And my experience, I think, that relates to being on this panel is that I'm a frustrated entrepreneur trying to get some things advanced. My experience has been that it's been slow and difficult in the institutions I've been part of. I think it's changing. I'm hopeful that it's changing. My view on the differences between basic and applied research is that basic research is typically curiosity-driven. To use an analogy, people like to can study, the number of fairies on the head of a pin, but the practicality of that is not exactly clear. And so, applied research, in my mind, is where you are trying to answer a particular question and apply that answer to solve a particular problem. And of course, though, I think it's a continuum. A great example of this, I think, is CRISPR technology, trying to understand, a number of years ago, the immunity of bacteria and how immunity of bacteria actually works. I don't think they had the idea that the applications for CRISPR technology that we're witnessing today is revolutionizing not only basic research, but a lot of applied research and gene therapies and so on. So that's my view. I think it's temporal, and I think as we mature as individuals, we go along in our career, we tend to move away from at least personally, move away from the number of fairies on a pin to think a little bit more about our legacies and how we might be able to have impact.
So it's interesting because I think all of you said in different ways the same thing. There's this notion that, a part of the definition of applied work is the outcome, the impact, which is suggestive that basic research without the elements of applied maybe don't lead to the action, maybe they enable the ultimate impacts, but they don't necessarily drive the impact. And so to our young students in the audience that are probably contemplating how they're going to change the world with their work, one message I'm taking away from all of you is that if the intent is ultimately to stare at that patient or the doctor that is thanking you for helping treat that patient successfully, really the journey of applied science is where you're going to find that full translational.
Yeah, so look, let me jump in and say I'm going to, just to liven things up, I'm going to take a little issue with using the word impact because you can think about an elegant scientific theory or an elegant synthesis process that has huge impact on a community of 250 other scientists who are then going to use that and then create other things that may have direct applicability to other people. So I'm not so sure I want to use a differentiation on the word impact, because all good science and all good translation and all good engineering has impact. The question is, who are you impacting? So remember, impact is what people do differently when they find out what you did. That's impact. So a brilliant scientist can have huge impact on an entire field. Someone else may actually then translate that into an outcome that affects a broad group of people. And so I'm going to nudge you a little bit and say, nah, I think impact is had by both sides. It's where is the impact?
We just choose to do it. Yep. Very good point. Now, the other comment I heard, and this leads me to my next question, is it a necessary ingredient of pursuing high quality basic science to also then do the applied sciences to get it translated? In other words, that is, you know, you at some level said, no, we're achieving impact with basic science because we're affecting everybody who's going to use those new principles to actually achieve the patient outcome in our industry. But you know, are we creating an artificial difference, or ultimately every piece of brilliant basic science ultimately includes an element of applied sciences as well?
I don't want to go first.
If I could just take a stab at this and say, you know, is it a precondition, applied aspect of research, a precondition for good basic research? Absolutely not. You know, I'll take the advantage or the example of Günter Blobel, who won the Nobel Prize for understanding how proteins move around cells. He spent his entire career, virtually his entire life, studying the basic biology of how proteins move around cells. And the influence that has had on cell biology in every aspect of biotechnology is immense. And, you know, he never, I mean, in his world, you know, applied research was, you know, sort of distasteful. It wasn't really what you did if you were a pure scientist. And he, as a pure scientist, ended up winning the Nobel Prize for doing what he did and pursued for his entire career. So I would say absolutely not, except for people like, perhaps like me, that are a little insecure in our discoveries and want to see if we can figure out a clinical or immediate influence of them.
Any other thoughts?
Well, I would say that no good, valid scientific discovery is without merit. It is not lost. So how about the PhD student that did the dodecahedron, for example? So that was a great value. Someday somebody might put an ion or a molecule in that dodecahedron. But if you go to Wikipedia and look up Pechet and his discovery of that, they'll say he had no further intention for that. So I think any work I've done, even when I have had a failed project, I found it valuable for other projects. So I think, but I think it's valid to keep that distinction between basic and applied in terms of the original intent. That's where it is. But what could happen later on could be great things.
I think I don't disagree with any of those thoughts. I think one thing that's important to keep in mind that sort of relates to what we were talking about before with impact, I think, is really the role of like good science communication. You know, you could do basic science well or applied science well in terms of the actual science itself, but the impact is really driven about how you communicate that to different audiences. I mean, your work doesn't stop at, you know, getting a paper published and then you have 25 supplementary figures and tables. I mean, you really have to like package that into messages that can be absorbed by different audiences, especially in the applied science where you have different stakeholders involved, like investors, you have policymakers, you might have your end patients or your consumers, or even the general public, and you really need to be able to communicate well to all of those audiences to have impact on both basic and applied discovery sciences. I mean, just an example is like, imagine if Mark had just published that burger in a journal rather than present it on TV. I mean, by doing so, by having effective communication and a strategy around that literally launched a whole field. So I think that's really important to keep in mind, and it's sort of not a lot of scientists think about that enough.
So I wanted to take a crack at this from a slightly different angle. So a couple of years ago, the Department of Defense convened a Dean's Roundtable of engineering deans and asked them this question. Why, when we spend millions and billions of dollars for research, are we seeing other people outside the United States translate it into functional purpose? And why are we wasting, quote unquote, all our money supporting research in academia if that's what's happening? So with that as a backdrop, i.e. the funding agencies are worried about having impact, especially economic growth impact. With that as a backdrop, is it not necessary, and I alluded to the time to stir, right? Is it not necessary to not wait for the natural diffusion, as it were, between basic and applied science, but actually set up scenarios where you deliberately mix it together? Because, like it or not, the United States is in an innovation race with the rest of the world. And I won't go into too much geopolitical hot water here, but just pick a couple of big countries that aren't particularly friendly to us, count the number of people in those countries and say, oh, looks like about 10 times as many people as we have. And I don't believe for an instant that you don't have as many geniuses per capita there as here. So if you're going to have 10 times as many people working on the things we're working on, and we don't deliberately, not just blur, just homogenize some section of that spectrum, then you're never going to get the innovation rate you need in order to make sure that this country stays where it's at. So, I may be a little too hot-blooded about this topic, but I'm very, very convinced about it. Yes, I worked at DARPA for a while before I was in the middle of me being at Berkeley, so you can imagine there was a little contrast there between thought. I was an outsider on both sides of the coin. But I like your two sides of the coin, Elliot, metaphor, because they are close together. But you're going to have to start deliberately homogenizing that. Not everywhere, not for everyone, but there's got to be a process there.
Yeah, and I want you to hold on to that thought, Al, because we're going to come back to it. Because when it comes, there's an interesting question in this sort of generalized discussion we're having about how do you stimulate innovation and translation, about, some of the case study that your own institution has in how do you create the cement mixing effect that I think in many ways UCSD is doing very well, blurring those lines. Before we go to that, though, I think there's a purity of the basic sciences, a nobility perhaps associated. That probably is a reflection of yesteryears, but that is often, a challenge toward what I would describe as a collaboration, perhaps in an effort to do that cement mixing between those of us that are doing applied work versus those that are doing pure sciences work. And I think it's even reflected in your average academic institution, where sort of the staple of that institution is the department, and there are certain departments that consider themselves basic science, and they're very silos from, say, the engineering groups that by nature have to do the cement mixing. So I'm just curious to to hear a little bit an institutional perspective from each one of you, and you represent very different type of institutions, whether you do see sort of a silencing or whether collaboration exists in these sort of blurred lines, and other specific strategies your institution may have adopted. And maybe John, we'll do a round robin, but John, we'll start with you.
Sure, thanks, Maurizio. So I want to bring your attention to a book before we go on, and it's called The Usefulness of Useless Knowledge by Abraham Flexner. And it is a tiny book, and you can read it in 15 minutes or an hour maybe. But it's a wonderful thing to take on a plane with you and get some insight into the kind of advances basic sciences have had. It goes from like E equals MC squared to, the GPS. But what is our institution doing, and what have I seen? And it may reflect my own personal quest in my scientific career, and that is to have to increase my translational activities. And that may be why I'm at Seattle Children's and not at a more basic, basic cell biology department. But at Children's, they are really actively trying to identify opportunities for translational research. They're trying to build collaborations between the more basic scientists and the clinical scientists, because it is a hospital, and it's a hospital that treats children, and everything we do, even from a basic science perspective, we try to put it or see it through the lens of potential translational or clinical opportunities. And so I think it's that there's a selection process for people who want to do that. And at Children's, we are, there's a big effort, a lot of money is put into trying to establish mechanisms to bridge that gap that we all know about from that basic science discovery to the application, be it clinical or commercial. And I can go into more details about what they've done, but we can come back to that, I assume. Or would you like me to go into them now?
No, we'll come back to some of those topics. Anyone else wants to share their institutional perspective?
My institution for 44 years was an industrial institution. And so I'm jaded because from day one, everything was applied. But some of the best science to get to those products came out of industry. Just as one example, one case study, I worked for a startup. I moved to Boston to a startup called Focal Incorporated, and one of Bob Langer's companies, and it was the first and main product was based on developing a surgical sealant, and we developed the first U.S. Or world-approved, FDA-approved surgical sealant for lung surgery. The seminal patent came from one of the founders, Jeff Hubble, who developed that patent at the University of Texas, Austin. Focal subsequently developed almost 4 dozen new patents to get to the product. And so institutionally, if you're in an engineering department at a university, or if you're in a company, you're always thinking about applying the things that you have developed. I'm an organic chemist. I did organic, but from day one, I think I've been an engineer. Thank you.
Yeah, I think from an organization perspective, so I'm in the nonprofit world, but people sort of will describe us as a field catalyst. That's sort of the role that we play, which means that for all of the different stakeholders along the value chain, we sort of serve as a community builder. We serve as a knowledge hub. We do sort of think tank work. And generally, we're just sort of a force multiplier for all of these different groups that are trying to drive these industries forward. And so, by nature of that, on any given week, I could have conversations with investors. I could be talking to scientists in academia, life science companies that want to play a role in the industry. So I sort of serve as like a consultant to all of these people. But we also have a research grants program, which enables us to really be able to take the insights that we get from all those different perspectives and really hone in on what are the areas of need in the industry, because we're literally talking to the industry. Like, they are in our communities. We're like every day, sort of interacting with them. So just to give you a sense, we're a fairly new organization, but we've had a research grants program for 3 years where we've funded $13 million of research, 80 projects in 17 countries. And those researchers have already 10x'd the amount of follow-on funds just in that short amount of time, because we were really able to, I think, select projects that are super attractive and translatable. We've had 6 academic spinouts already that have similarly about 10x'd their money. One just raised $5 million this week. And so, yeah, I sort of live between, I think, these blurred lines. That's like really our sweet spot of how we're set up.
Yeah, and in a shameless self-promotion, I will tell the audience that the Terasaki Institute was the recipient of one of those grants very early on in our cellular agriculture program, which has already led to a spin-out, one of our spin-out company, a company called Omid, that is now off to the races. And so you really did help us catalyze some of that thinking. And it was an interesting journey because much of the work at the beginning looked a lot more like research, or basic research, if you want to think of it about that way, but it's very applied today. So, Al, I know you have done legendary work in your departments and overall at UCSD. You're sort of, what are the strategies that you're deploying?
Sure. So first, Elliot, kudos, man. Nice record. Please keep going. Do more. By the way, I have someone who wants to talk to you. Okay. All silly jokes aside, I'm going to offer a thought that I think many of us would agree with, but some of us may not. There is nothing linear anymore about the path between fundamental and applied. There is no progression. There are endless loops and counter loops and mixings. And so I'll offer this thought. Imagine an engineering school such that the dean, when confronted with, we'd like to hire a physicist into mechanical engineering. Sounds great. What? Yeah, go do it. No, I want a chemist over here in materials. Yeah, go ahead, do that. I want someone from biological sciences in my bioengineering department. Yeah, go ahead, do that. The time to make it easy for people to have these loops. 3 steps forward in the applied side. Hey, wait a minute, it's not working right. Maybe there's something wrong. Loop back. And the area in which I think this idea of going back and forth first came forward was in all the big tool development that surged maybe 15, 20, 30 years ago, right? I know a plasma physicist who ended up founding a plasma etcher company that ended up being bought by Applied Materials and used to make electronic circuits. Whoa, that's how'd you get from, and by the way, his discipline was fusion energy. What? How'd that happen? That, all the great tool makers, right, confocal microscopy and stuff like that, where 25, 30 years ago, people said, oh, you can't see more than clusters of atoms. Now it's like, hey, you want to see where that electron went? I'll show you. That is the first area where the mix started, because everyone wanted the tools. Okay, now the funding agencies and the government and the economy needs that kind of mixing magic for more and more stuff that comes out that is extremely complicated. And I'll end this by saying we are in an era of the emergence of systems and platform technologies. Bob Langer, right? The platform technology of mRNA vaccines. That can be pivoted. So, no, I'm going to apply it to that. I want to apply it here. Whoops, something still has to be fixed. Go back to the fundamentals. These two things, the organizations that grasp systems and platform technologies are going to be extremely powerful. Oh, by the way, what do you think my school did? That's exactly how we're trying to retool the school in the next 5 years.
Fascinating, and it reminds me of a conversation I had with a very well-known basic scientist who, the question was really about how he thought of the next big advances in basic science. And we happen to be talking about physics. And what he told me is that he's thinking about his discipline as a basic science increasingly in an interdisciplinary manner. Mm-hmm. And people sometimes don't understand the concept of interdisciplinarity. Interdisciplinarity, the inter is key. It doesn't mean multidisciplinary. Interdisciplinary means integrating a collection of sciences into essentially a new science that has opportunities and discovery at this sort of intersection. And I think as I reflect on most of the conversations today about the great breakthroughs in biomedicine that we were hearing, both historically and so on, a lot of those breakthroughs came from blurring those lines and looking at the intersect of those. And I think a lot of what you're describing now, that physicist in your mechanical engineering department, or that the biologist in your bioengineering, I think is a way to sort of think that way. And do you think, therefore, and this is a question to all of you, that to do the great translation of tomorrow, we really do need to get those sort of blended teams that can practice interdisciplinarity for real? And does that actually change the strategy for applied research? John, I'll put you on the spot. Because
I'm sorry.
You go ahead.
Well, I think, the way that you put it, and maybe a little bit different, is that it's using diverse skills toward a common goal. But having a team that can address different goals, that's the trick, having some longevity to the team that you choose. It might be them joining a department. It might have them being cross-departmental, as we're doing at Northeastern right now. We have lots and lots of bio-e, chemistry, those kinds of things going on. But there are always, as far as I can tell, all of my young colleagues, and I'm way older than any of my colleagues in either department, bio-e or chemi, they want their legacy, their engineers, they want their legacy to be in products that are useful for society.
So I'll just add a point to, I think, what is clear, that we do need these interdisciplinary collaborations, and we need them for basic science as well as applied science, I would say, to your physicist friend's point. But I think we need also to have a cultural system where those individuals interact very easily without any activation energy between those interactions. And the activation energy can come from physical separation or reporting to different deans from different schools. These sorts of things, I think, are challenges. But to the extent that we can reduce those barriers, I think that's where the magic happens. The magic will happen in applied and in basic research. And, especially, I think about my challenges with translation to clinical applications. These hospital docs they're busy, and they're in a hospital, and they're running around chasing patients all the time, and trying to find time for some sort of new idea is really a challenge for them. And so we need to figure out how to reduce those barriers and allow us to interact and come up with crazy ideas and follow them.
Yeah, I just from my own experience, I don't know how you get anything done without having interdisciplinary teams of experts nowadays. Even in grad school, I was doing cell culture most of the time, but it's like I need a bioinformatician to like analyze this data. Like, when am I supposed to learn that? I have no idea. Like, so I think some of the challenges are, it's not that there's not these personnel that are out there. It's about being able to create an environment where they're supported. And I think a lot of the limitation there is like money, because you can't really have an hugely interdisciplinary lab with all these different disciplines if you don't have the money to support them. And same thing in a company as well. So yeah, that's a harder problem to solve.
So that's actually a great segue to the next question I was going to ask you, which is about money. I'll share an experience that some of our PIs here at Terasaki went through. You obviously know, or I think by now everybody knows, that interdisciplinarity in our approach is sort of one of our cornerstones. And within our team, we don't have departments, and we have entirely blended teams that are working together toward common problems from different disciplines. And that's carried all the way into both our programs and even the physical design of our lab. And all that sounds great, to practice all the things that you are saying. And recently we had the experience of being turned down on some of our NIH grant applications, not because the proposed science wasn't great, and the reviewers actually acknowledged, but because they couldn't figure out which institute we belonged, because we didn't fit any of the siluses that they went. So I'm just curious, do you think the funders are understanding the need for this interdisciplinarity? Does that present perhaps some challenges? And should you be, are there new funding mechanisms emerging that actually reward these more interdisciplinary approaches?
I can start. I mean, I think I would say, at least from my perspective, I'm working in cultured meat. These alternative protein technologies, they're like very, very new. So like if someone's applying to the NSF, those reviewers don't get it at all yet. Like, we are now focusing efforts on educating reviewer teams and program admins at these government agencies to sort of get them up to speed on where the industry's at, why it's really important and urgent right now. I think that's going to take some time, but we're sort of trying to build those foundational blocks. But one of the other things that we do is, we have a whole policy team, and their objective is really to drive more public R&D dollars into these fields in general. So just to give you an example, we got, in the California legislature, it was passed $5 million earmarked to actually UC Berkeley, UC Davis, and here at UCLA, specifically earmarked to cultivated meat research last year. We have a team in Israel that worked with the Israel Innovation Authority. They funded an $18 million public-private consortium for cultivated meat research there. And they also, we are proposing now things like matching funds. We put up $250K, and they put up $1 million in Israel just recently. And so there's mechanisms and incentives that I think you can do, as well as like blended finance, which is part of like project finance. You take in philanthropic dollars, and then you sort of de-risk some of the projects from a government perspective. I think you can sort of do that as an NGO. We can do that to sort of just increase the impact and the overall spread of funds. But there's a lot more work to be done, I think, obviously.
Well, and we heard yesterday in our other panel about the role of philanthropy and NGO increasingly becoming important in some of these transition areas. And so, thank you for doing that kind of work, because it is catalytic. Any other thoughts on the funding?
Yeah, I'd like to, I'm sorry, did I?
Go ahead.
So I'd like to offer this thought. So I spent some time at DARPA, and I have a lot of friends at NSF. We all know that all these program managers outwardly smile to us, and when they go home, they beat each other over the head trying to get a larger share of the central money to run through their programs. All right? There is a certain competition in that. If the competition is too high, then you can only propose to do projects that are in your core, totally defendable against any other kind of challenge. And so I see the philanthropists as the cavalry coming to the rescue. They are not encumbered with that. Now, I'm not saying protecting your turf is wrong, because there are certain core things that need to be protected, right? Okay, but maybe there's an emerging divergence of purpose here. Now, I know NSF is busy doing its Technology Innovation Program office, and we'll see how that turns out. But what you have is philanthropists are going to be a lot more outcome driven, and they're going to be a lot less. They're going to be a lot more technology agnostic. Their position is, look, will you just fix a thing? Happy to provide the money. I want to see a solution. So I think they almost look like rows and columns of a matrix approach. And the more philanthropists that join the fray, the better. That takes some pressure off the funding agencies. And I don't know if you're ever going to solve the turf issues. That's just human nature. But if you have these two people with slightly different views, that's almost like mirroring what we're talking about here, the blurring of the line between. I'd like to see the blurring of the money between.
Yep.
Maurizio, could I just, sorry,
Yeah, please.
could I just add another perspective? So your problem of interdisciplinary research has been my career, honestly. Since about 2000, when we started the Institute for Systems Biology, we were physicists and molecular biotechnologists and cell biologists that were trying to figure out how to speak each other's languages. And we tried to get external funding, and we spent a lot of time on that challenge. I will say that I think, from the NIH perspective, there are pockets within the NIH that are very, sympathetic to, and in fact encouraging, of interdisciplinary research. And I think it's a matter of finding them, but they are there. And I still sit on NIH panels, and I only read interdisciplinary grants. So they're there, and I'm happy to talk to you offline about how perhaps to find them. But I haven't given up hope on that at all. And if you compare it to where we were in 2000, we are hugely in a far better position than we ever were.
My advice would be to use him as an advisor. I had Joachim Cohn as an advisor to my company. I was in the company, and we applied for grants. And what he said, and I might be stating the obvious, you can learn an awful lot about the rejection, and you could follow the guidelines that they give you there. And I'm sure you'll get some of them if you do that. You know that. So.
No, and I'm sure what you're saying is music to the ears of our young investigators that are going through the experience now. And Arthur, I had a corollary to the question. I mean, we talked about philanthropy and donors and the agility, the inherent agility that they might have, as well as the pockets that may exist in classic funding. What about industry? Do you see industry as being a potential partner in this sort of interdisciplinary, but perhaps fast driving?
There are different levels. If industry, if it's a startup company, they're going to have to use your technology that you start with, and they're going to have to pay for it. If it's Medtronic, whom I worked for, they need to be won over by the magnitude of the opportunity. But if they are, they can pay big money. In my courses, I use a valley of death, and you can only get so far to the bridge, and you have to justify getting across the bridge. But then Medtronic has to come up with $150 million more, and they will and you have to use all of your skills, all of your guys, everything. Bring them in early. Keep in touch with them, get enough funding to get across the bridge, and win them over with the urgency of the success that you have generated across the bridge. But they have money there. And we have gotten more money from drug companies, actually, than from device companies for collaborations, multi-million-dollar collaborations. Look at it as a collaboration rather than a grant.
And John, I know you personally had some discoveries lately that went down this translational, including your own startups, but actually didn't work out. So I'd be curious, without prying too much on your private affairs, for you to talk to us about some of the sources of frustration about this sort of translational through industry and spin out.
Well, let me just two examples that I think illustrate part of the problems that and pitfalls to avoid for others. The first is we had a really great idea around a diagnostic, and not we, the senior scientist in my group had a really great idea, and we decided that the best way to pursue this and move it to the next stage was SBIRs or STTR funding, and the problem with that, I would say, is that it was early stage, and it just was not enough money to actually do the job. And the company still limps along. We started a company so we could get an SBIR. The company still limps along, and I would say there's still great promise in it, but it's just so damn slow, it's painful. You know, the first grants are $500,000 or so, and the intentions are good, but it's just not enough money to really get things off the ground. And so then the second one was, you know, at the beginning of the pandemic, we had a collaboration to develop therapeutics and diagnostics for COVID. And this was a unique nanobody approach that I'm sure people are aware of what nanobodies are. But, and we had a company that was incredibly excited about this. And rather than going through the SBIR route, we decided we would you know, speak to this company and we patented, of course, and licensed the technology to the company. But to your point about a platform, they were more interested in the platform than a therapy for COVID. And because they were so interested in a platform, they actually didn't take this to the right people, to the right VCs. And the lesson there was, I think we missed this opportunity. I mean, the pandemic's not over, so the pandemic is over, but COVID is not over. So I think there's still lots of opportunity. But I think the lesson is timing. That we have, I mean, when you've got an opportunity and you want to be able to translate it, there's a narrow window for that opportunity to be translated, and I think we need to figure out how to capitalize on that to make these advances.
So thank you. We are getting the 5-minute warning, so I want to open it up to questions from the audience, if there are any. I think you're going to get a mic.
First of all, thank you very much. To have that many highly accomplished and highly intelligent people together in a panel is a real dream come true. By way of background, I come from industry, just like yourself, and now I'm in academia since the sale of my 2 companies. But I'd like to really focus on the title, Blurring the Lines Between Basic versus Applied Science. Coming from industry and from the R&D side, and then becoming a CEO of the company, I have to say that those lines were blurred a long time ago. Talking about blurring it now doesn't exist. Right now, it is the leadership that has to be educated. I'll tell you why. Al made some very important points. He and I both share fundamentally background in MEMS technology. And when I started developing these MEMS sensors, I needed not just electrical engineers, not just mechanical engineers, not just bioengineers, not just physicists, not just chemists, not just people who understood strength of materials. I needed all those expertise. Now, we just talked about interdisciplinary versus multidisciplinary. This is a perfect example of interdisciplinary. And just as a footnote, to get the first commercialized gyroscope to be used ubiquitously for electronic stability and rollover protection, and to have it commercialized from aerospace and defense, took us $100 million plus. Yeah. Now, why I say the lines have been blurred. Today, there is a very interesting field called behavioral informatics. Behavioral informatics tries to study things that we don't know. How do you have early detection of autism? How do you go and fundamentally understand suicidal tendencies that people have? How do you observe through body language dependencies on drugs, suicidal tendencies? Now, if those MEMS sensors, that interdisciplinary technology, did not exist, you would not get the data that you know to start this multi-disciplinary field of behavioral informatics. So I think, like Al kept saying, you've got to mix these. I think the lines were blurred a long time ago. It's just that we are expanding, and evolution is taking its course with reference to technology, and we're going to go further and further and further, and we will have new fields that we did not, whose fundamental aspects we didn't understand, like behavioral informatics. We just didn't understand these things. So from one side you can call it applied, from the other side you can call it fundamental, basic understanding. Actually, it's really blurred. And I don't mean this, a lot of buzzwords, and I don't mean to be too critical, system of systems and transdisciplinary and, block diagram on top of block diagram on top of block diagram, and yet I can't find a single solution or a single product or a single big project facing us that has been solved by these things. I'm talking of real engineering, the kind of things you people are doing. So my position is lines were blurred a long time ago. We are moving from one phase to the other to complexity. And while we are doing that from a technical standpoint, our fundamental understanding is also increasing simultaneously. So they are intertwined and cannot really be separated. Thank you.
Thank you.
Combine your sensors with AI, like we heard yesterday. And I think that's going to answer your question, your issue that we haven't yet solved.
Great. Thanks for that wonderful discussion. Josh Graf-Zivan from UCSD here. I just wanted to make a remark here. I feel the conversation started with define basic versus applied, and you all very naturally took either an investigator or an institutional perspective on that question. Do I do applied? Do I do basic? But there's a broader innovation ecosystem here, which you all then subsequently went and seamlessly transitioned to talking about when you talked about the subsequent questions. And so my question to all of you, I don't know that we have time to answer it, but let me at least plant the seed, is there are lots of actors in this system, some of which are doing what we would have conventionally called a basic and some of which we would conventionally call applied, although I don't like either of those terms. It strikes me that the challenge is how to get those institutions, those individuals, to interact with each other in meaningful ways. And they live in very boundaried places. If I'm an investigator, I want to win the grant, right? If I'm Al, I want my school to be number 1. And those are not always aligned with the broader goals of inventing for impact. And so I'd love to hear thoughts on that.
Well, I have one idea, at least, that this brings to mind. It sort of goes back to like the IP discussion and how important that is, and like the sort of how incentives are aligned. But I mean, there's interesting new sort of ideas in crypto land. If you've heard of the idea of a decentralized autonomous organization, but essentially that allows you to fractionalize ownership of IP in different ways that would allow you to basically have people come together and sort of fund a project from different directions where that IP is owned by multiple parties, not just the institution or not just the professor. And I think if you can sort of solve some of the friction there, you can more easily create this environment where people are sort of coming together over a shared interest rather than just acting on in their silos. So I'll just put that idea out there.
Joshua, I'm going to ask you the same question in your presentation a little bit later, where I think you're really talking about incentives for innovation, because I think it's a very topical conversation, and I've got a big red screen here that says we have to wrap up. So we won't really address your question, but we'll come back to it when you're up here. Thank you, everyone, and thank you, our panelists.